Zimbabwe's economy prior to the IMF-sponsored structural adjustment programs in the 1990s. It is imperative that Africans, particularly Zimbabweans in this case, begin to wake up. After independence in 1980, sanctions that had been imposed on Rhodesia under the Unilateral Declaration of Independence were removed, and so the Zimbabwean independent government was able to participate in international monetary policy. But soon after independence, the GDP or gross domestic product of Zimbabwe rose 16%, manufacturing sector alone was up 15%. The country, however, experienced a drought between 82 and 83, and manufacturing also declined about 29% in the period, which forced the government to use its IMF credit to cover shortfalls in government expenditures. But by 1985, the country was experiencing about a 7% GDP growth. So the government continued to invest heavily in social programs such as education and healthcare, which had great returns later, even though they were costly. The government decided to implement policy reforms to control spending, and this laid the foundation for the IMF Economic Structural Adjustment Program known as ESAP. The Zimbabwean government invested in social programs and was actively involved in the manufacturing sector with the goal of improving the well-being of its black citizens who had been second-class citizens prior to independence. As a result, Zimbabwe enjoyed the highest literacy rates in Africa from the 1990s to the 2000s because of the investments the government made in education. Prior to ESAP, the unemployment rate was about 10%. The growth of the industrial sector was about 4.2% from 87 to 91. And in the 1980s, manufacturing accounted for between 10 to 18% of exports in that decade. During this time, the World Bank sponsored studies that suggested that 73% of Zimbabwe's manufacturing was so inefficient that it needed to be restructured or shut down. Luckily, the government ignored these suggestions, and after the government ignored these suggestions, the World Bank then published new reports that concluded the manufacturing sector was actually efficient. So why did the World Bank change their conclusions? Zimbabwe's economy could have been devastated even more if they had listened to the suggestions. So now the question, even now, why do we continue to listen to the IMF and the World Bank? African leaders need to stop listening to the World Bank and the IMF, and we might actually see some progress on the continent.